Do not assume that your main program is going to work. Have backup plans and have your backup plans. Have backup plans.
This video is sponsored by LJD Law.
Hey everyone, it's Daniel, one half of Bed Daniel. Today, I'm speaking with our immigration lawyer. He's the one who helped Bed and I become permanent residents in just under 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, LOU Dangzalan. Hey LOU.
Hey Daniel, thanks for having me on your show, and thanks everyone for coming in to listen in today.
Of course. Hey, so they already know you from the previous video. We're gonna jump right into it just because that's what you all want. You want info straight up, so we're gonna jump right to it. So, first question, Lou, is about express entry to permanent residency. Some of our viewers are not aware that it was actually paused. Like the government just paused it for a while. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. So, as you know, Daniel, express entry is Canada's main door to get into Canada as a permanent resident directly. And under express entry, you have several programs, which include the Federal Skilled Worker Program. There's also the Canadian Experience Class and the Federal Skilled Trades, and a smattering of provincial nomination programs. And it did go on pause, you're right. And this was around the time of the pandemic, at the peak of it anyway. So they stopped making draws for federal skilled worker, for example. And that's usually where people from outside Canada would come in directly as permanent residents. And the rationale was that they're outside Canada, they don't want to encourage travel. There were a lot of travel restrictions at the time, so they put it on pause. In the alternative, the Government of Canada focused on the Canadian Experience Class on the assumption that most of the candidates would already be in Canada. So what they wanted to do was they did in Canada draws only through the Canadian Experience Class. And the effect was that a lot of people who were already in Canada, whether they're international students or skilled workers in Canada, they benefited a lot. And as a result, a portion of that pool who qualified under the Canadian Experience Class, we saw the cutoff scores go down significantly. That was true until sometime in 2021, in about August, in the month of August, the Government of Canada paused doing draws for the Canadian Experience Class as well, which was surprising for a lot of people. So essentially what you had was you only had federal skilled trades, which actually didn't really happen, but the draws under express entry were confined to the provincial nomination program. And a lot of people who were expecting to get their PR through CEC didn't get it, and they had to wait until this year, in the month of July, towards the end of July, when the Government of Canada resumed the draws.
Okay. And just on that note, was that why the TR to PR program was created last year, just because they were prioritizing people within Canada, and that's why we became permanent residents?
That's correct. So the TR to PR pathway program, which is, by the way, a one-time program, was a special program created to transition those who were already in Canada to become permanent residents. So let's take a step back and understand it from the perspective of the Government of Canada. They have what's called the multi-year levels plan for immigration. And the danger of the pandemic was that they were not going to meet the targeted numbers for permanent residents. And that was true for the year 2020. So they took a step back and they recalibrated their plans, announced the new level plans, and then in that plan, they had essentially a slice of that pie that was dedicated to what's called the TR to PR pathway. And on top of that, they had a special draw for a Canadian Experience Class where the cutoff score was so low because they issued somewhere around 25,000 invitations to basically, transition those who were already in Canada, qualified under express entry, to basically help the government meet its target for that year. So if you'll notice, in 2022, there's not actually a similar program. They're still processing some TR to PR pathway applicants to this date, for example. What we're going to likely see is that the government is going to focus its attention back to express entry.
Gotcha. And yeah, you mentioned the express entry is now resumed, like by the government. Can you tell us more about that?
So as I mentioned earlier, they resumed towards the end of July. There's been about 6-7 draws to date, and the score cutoff initially was at around 557. That meant that people who would have good scores would basically qualify under this program. And I'm looking at folks who are under 30, who have master's degrees, for example, or first professional degrees such as doctors, lawyers, or pharmacists, for example. Those who would have at least 2 years skilled work experience. Those who would have, let's say, a valid job offer to get those extra 50 points. Those who are bilingual in English and French. So these are the prime candidates that Canada really, really, really wants. And the effect is that a typical person who has a bachelor's degree, about 3 years work experience, who is about 35 years old, has no chance if they only speak one of the official languages, has no chance if they don't have a job offer, a valid job offer in Canada. So today, as we're recording this, it's still very competitive. The latest draw was 510. And notice that I mentioned 557 at the beginning, and now it's 510. What we're seeing is progressively the scores are going down, and more importantly, progressively, the government is actually issuing more and more invitations. And that's good, because that means that the top tier candidates are going to be exhausted, so it's going to go back to some sense of normalcy.
And in terms of points, because the points change, right?
That's right.
Would you know how that's determined? Is it random, or is it like, let's just put a high score first, just because we know there's a huge chunk of people that we have to go through? How does that work?
Sure. I'll tell you that it doesn't work with dartboards. No, it's not by lottery. People think that it's a lottery, but it's not. So it works by having candidates in the pool, and each candidate has assigned scores depending on their factors, human capital factors, special factors such as work experience in Canada. But what you're really looking for would be the number of invitations in a particular round, because by way of statistics, how it would work is that cutoff point where they do invitations is determined by the quality of the candidates in the pool. So in a sense, think of a dam. So if you're accumulating a lot of candidates or water in the dam, and you get really good water at the top, that's the first to go, depending on where the cutoff is. And the release of the dam would be the number of invitations. So in effect, if you have about 20,000 candidates in the pool and the government of Canada decides to issue 5,000 invitations, you can expect the score to be, let's say, at a particular range of, let's say, 500. But if they issue more invitations, of course that score cutoff would go down, just because of the rules of math and numbers, right? So it's not random. It's not a lottery. It's not it's not a dart board. It's definitely determined by the numbers. It's also a bit of art at the same time, because you don't know exactly who's going to enter the pool, right? So what is the demand? And what I can say right now, Daniel, is that there's such a huge demand to come to Canada these days, because Canada is seen as one of the countries that fared a bit better than a lot of countries out there in terms of outcomes for health during the pandemic, for education, and all the supports that you can get from, or a lot of people got over the course of the pandemic, right?
Right, exactly. And I think one of the most stressful parts of that phase where you're trying to be a permanent resident is, as a viewer, you know this, when you're computing your points, even before you go here, when you're computing for your points for express entry, you're like, wow, I'm at 250. Wow, I'm at 300. And you know that the cutoff is at like 500. What's like your best tip for someone who wants to increase their score to that like higher range so that they can get invited?
That's a really good question. First, as I mentioned earlier, Express Entry works with human capital factors, right? And the first human capital factor that you can look at would be your age. So if you're over 30, essentially how the system works is they punish you the older that you get. So you essentially have full score for points for age, so long as you're under the age of 30. And then as you hit 30, and every year until 45, your score progressively goes down until you hit 0.
Wow.
And it's, the points for age can be as high as 125 if you're a couple, for example.
Yeah.
So it really, really dramatically affects your score.
Right.
And where we see it start to hurt really is at the age of 35 going forward. Between my colleagues and myself, we call the age of 40 basically the cliff dive. because it just jumps radically down. And you really have to figure out ways to increase your score. And it really ties into your question nicely. What are the things that you can actually control? So other human capital factors that you can control would be language, right? So most of your audience is Filipinos understand, but we also know that English in the Philippines is kind of variable. Generally people do speak English, but then the language tests, that's where it really boils down to. And if you perform really well in the language test, it has an impact on your score from a human capital perspective. But also, if you end up working in Canada, they have what's called adaptability points. So you get more points if you hit a certain benchmark from the perspective of the government of Canada. They give you bonus points, essentially, because from their perspective, they see you as someone who would excel and essentially take root in Canada.
Right. And like, what do you say for some viewers, because we get questions of like, hey, I'm 38, I'm like 40. Do you think it's still worth it for them to like, yeah, maybe I can go the student route?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We always get this question, and I would say yes to a degree, with certain asterisks associated with it, and mostly because we know that the other pathways to immigration, apart from express entry, such as the Atlantic Immigration Program, such as provincial nomination programs across 10 different provinces, plus 3 territories in Canada, they have very different requirements. And sometimes age is not as important for them. What they really look for are material ties to the province. I'll give you 2 examples. The provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. What they focus on, apart from human capital factors, is your connection to the province. So if you have family or friends or relatives in those provinces, they give you extra points. Not under express entry, but through their own system. Because they have their own system. It's a direct to the province application, not through express entry. And when the province endorses you, they nominate you, and then you can apply directly for permanent residence to the government of Canada. So if you live in these provinces, you get extra points. If you have work experience in these provinces, that puts you in an ideal situation to actually get that nomination from the province, which is a direct application, and your age may not matter as much. And what we're seeing in these programs as well is that if you have work experience in that particular province, you're in a really good position to actually get those points from their system to be able to apply for nomination and secure permanent residence. So again, going back, age, language, and then experience in Canada, which then goes back to your question about studying in Canada. Is it still a viable option? And the short answer for those who require a visa to come to Canada is yes, because studying in Canada does open up points for education, another factor that you can control.
Right.
So you have education from, let's say, the Philippines, you have to get it assessed for immigration purposes. There are points. But if you upgrade in Canada by taking further studies, you get even more points, though sometimes it's a marginal gain. But the important thing is, after you're done studying in Canada, if you take the right program at the right institution, you can get what's called a post-graduation work permit. And that is a type of a work permit that is open, so you can take most types of employment, and you can work practically in most places in Canada. In fact, if not all of them, there's no restriction. And the benefit to that is you start to build skilled work experience in Canada that allows you to boost your points even more. So the short answer to your question is yes, it's still viable, but what's important is you need to be selective where you're doing that. So you and Bea, I think you belong to a special generation just before the pandemic happened. And what it is that you can still select the big cities, the allure of the big city, right? Like that shining city on the hill, that's great. But moving forward, I've always been advising my clients that if you're selecting a program, you're selecting a province, you need to look at their programs. How do you fit as a puzzle piece in that giant jigsaw of immigration?
Exactly. I was like agreeing so much just because a lot of our viewers are like, hey, let's go to Toronto because it's nice there.
Right.
You have to plan this out. And again, like at this point in the video, if you're feeling like kind of scared or pressured about it, just check the description below and you can book a consultation with Lou and his team. He'll really do, again, he's the best. He'll do an amazing job helping you out. Yeah, going back, Lou, would you know if like at this point in 2022, are there like any changes or updates to the Express Entry
Right.
program?
So as you know, and as we mentioned, Express Entry recently resumed.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the scores progressively go down. But we also know the latter half of the first half of the year, the Government of Canada passed a budget. And in the budget, there was a provision that basically allows the minister to make changes to Express Entry. And I think it's very important for your viewers to know that Express Entry will see changes starting in January. So how we know it right now may not necessarily be the case in January when the government makes its announcements. And from what we know so far, there's very little information. They're keeping their cards close to their chest. What the government is going to do is likely to target certain occupations that Canada wants to prioritize in terms of meeting its labor shortages. For example, those who are in the healthcare sector might actually benefit from this. We know that there's a massive shortage of nurses and doctors. And we also know that they've already announced, just yesterday in fact, changes to how points are calculated for physicians and doctors. Because traditionally, they could not count self-employment in Canada for qualification under Canadian Experience Class. Moving forward, it will now be qualified. And there could be changes in certain occupations such as orderlies or those who work in long-term care facilities that traditionally could not qualify under Express Entry. They're now going to be included into the pool. So the bottom line here, Daniel, is that we need to be ready and we need to be very careful about our options for permanent residence because it's about to get more competitive.
Ooh. So like basically what you know now in your minds of like, yeah, that's how I'm gonna become a PR.
Right.
That could totally change in January 2023.
That's right.
That's amazing. So yeah, you just have to like be updated about everything else, and just do your own research, or again, just book a consultation with an expert such as Lou, or if you want to go to anyone else, that's okay. But really do your research because what you know now, again, it can change in a few months, and that could totally change your plan. All right. So let's go to the topic of study permits,
Right.
as a viable option for permanent residency. You did mention this earlier, but do you think that in 2022 and beyond, studying in Canada is still the best and easiest way to become a permanent resident fast?
No, this is very important, and we've seen the rise in international students coming to Canada for a variety of reasons. One of them is, certain countries closed their doors, and then Canada kept its open, so we are seeing a surge in demand. Just a few days ago, in fact, the government came out with a report as a response to a motion by a member of parliament in Ottawa that basically called for the government to create pathways for transitioning those who are already in Canada to become permanent residents. And in that motion, they did specifically mention international students. So the M44 report, which you'll likely find in the links below, it's a report that tackles on how the government sees how the current programs would be used to essentially transition international students to permanent residence. So the main takeaway here are 2 points. The first is that, yes, international students are still seen as a major source of permanent residence in Canada, which means that they are still a viable, pathway to permanent residence in Canada. But number 2, you need to be careful. When you come to Canada as an international student, you need to be very strategic and selective when choosing your DLI or your college or university. You have to be very strategic when selecting your province of destination. Of course, that will depend on your baseline factors such as your age or work experience. But all that to say, if you want to be very careful in, protecting your investment, because it's no joke, studying in Canada is not cheap. You want to be able to exercise all possible options for permanent residents. So you need to be selective.
Right, exactly. That's like how Ben and I did it as well. Because a lot of people, again, and some of our viewers do this. You go here, and then you feel like, oh yeah, if I study in this institution, I get high grades, I'll get a job and become PR just like that. It's not that easy, y'all. It's not that easy. You have to be strategic. And do you have any updates? Are there any changes happening in the student or study permit route right now?
Right. So we are seeing a gradual normalization of study permit processing. As you guys probably know, you know that there's been a massive backlog and delay because of things resuming, things opening up. I guess no one really was ready to coming back to normal, right? Although we are still in a pandemic, unfortunately, but things are gradually getting better. What I will say is that we know that the government of Canada is also implementing certain changes and reforms in processing study permits, such as the use of new technology in order to facilitate the transition and essentially to facilitate the processing of these applications. We also know that they use advanced analytics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence to triage applications when they are submitted to the government. We also know that they use this tool called Chinook, which is essentially a dashboard that facilitates the processing of applications. Of course, there are certain controversies surrounding artificial intelligence, racial bias, for example. And what we know from the government is that they are doing algorithmic impact assessments to do that. But in a nutshell, you need to adjust and adapt to the way that these systems are being set up. Your applications must be fine-tuned to actually fit those categories that the government is using in submitting your application, because ultimately, while a person still makes a decision, the way that they triage your application matters a lot in terms of selecting a pathway.
Right. And since we're on that topic, I think one of the main points for a study permit being declined is I think the main factor is the study plan, like this.
Right.
Is it called the SOP?
Yeah, the SOP or the study plan.
So we've been receiving a lot of questions as well, like, hey, my student permit or student visa just got denied. What do I do now? So I think the question is, do you have any tips for those who got denied, their study permits got denied?
Right. First is, don't lose hope. Unfortunately, in the day and age where there's a lot of people trying to get into Canada, we are seeing, just the pressures of the demand that the applications are not processed in the right way. So sometimes even if you prepare a fantastic study permit application, you might still get refused. There are no guarantees in these. Even if you hire, a really good lawyer or a consultant to do that, there are no guarantees. So the first step, apart from not losing hope, would be to basically obtain the reasons why you were refused. So you will be notified by immigration by what's called a refusal letter, and that refusal letter will include notes as regards to what is the basis of the refusal. Those notes are not the refusal reasons. The refusal reasons are actually something you can order from the Government of Canada by way of a Privacy Privacy Act request and access to information request, where you can order what's called the GCMS notes, or the Global Case Management System notes. And in those notes, you will find the officer's notes to justify why they refused your application for a study permit. And what you want to do is, when you get those GCMS notes, you want to distill the main points of the reasons for refusal. The officer's notes would contain those. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's kind of hard to understand what they're trying to say, but essentially what you want to do when you distill those points is you need to respond to it point by point in your new study plan. That is if you're reapplying, right? But there are other ways to actually contest a refusal, such as asking for reconsideration, but that's usually very difficult in the context if you're applying from outside Canada. But if it's from outside Canada, you also have the recourse or the option to go to the Federal Court of Canada and ask for that decision to be reviewed judicially by a judge.
Wow. But yeah, there's don't lose hope, because we do have friends who got rejected the first time, and then they just had to submit their study plan again, and then they just got accepted.
Yeah, the most recent one I had was he was refused for 3 times. And he didn't lose hope, although it was very testing, and we were able to turn it around in 3 months.
Wow. To So don't lose hope, y'all. It's just a matter of time. Do you have any exciting news on like regarding the study permits? Because for some reason, you know, on Instagram and on the internet, we just see like, oh, another TR to PR is happening.
Right.
It's coming in September and October. Do you have any insights on that?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the TR to PR pathway is a special one-time program from 2021. The government has made indications that there could be another one, but they're not very precise and they're being very coy about it. Now, I also mentioned the M44 motion 44 report, government response to the motion by a member of parliament. In that report, they didn't specifically mention that there would be a TR to PR pathway, but if you look very closely in between the lines, you'll see a graph there that actually allocates a certain number of permanent resident slots, and they labeled it as TR to PR. Does that mean that there's going to be a new program? We don't know. What we can say is that it could be a form of a TR to PR program, but I don't think it'll be the same as it was in 2021. They will adjust. Furthermore, the numbers that were indicated were about 74,000 slots, but that's for the allocation for 2023 up to 2025. So that means if you split that up evenly between 3 years, it's about 20,000-ish, right? 25,000 maybe, being generous. So at the end of the day, don't use a special program as your primary function or your primary pathway to permanent residence. What you will want to do is rely on the mainstays such as Express Entry, the provincial nomination program. Make a plan, roadmap, and layer your options. Do not assume that your main program is going to work. Have backup plans and have your backup plans. Have backup plans.
Exactly. And again, that's what happened to BNI. Like, initially, when we consulted with LOU, it was just about, hey, can you help us process our PGWP or postgraduate work permit? But BNI were ready to go the express entry route. Like, that was our main plan. All of a sudden, LOU was like, hey, there's this special pathway that's coming up.
That's right.
And you prepared for it already, so you're eligible. So always have a plan. Always have a plan. And I think before we close this off, I think the main two questions would be for those who are who are planning to study in Canada, plan to immigrate here, what would be your best advice to them in terms of becoming a permanent resident here?
My best advice is to be prepared for the unpreparable, which means that expect the unexpected, because it is quite the roller coaster ride. I know there's a lot of metaphors there, guys. I apologize. But all that to say is that it's very unpredictable, and you need to accept that going in. Some people get lucky because they're at the right time at the right place, but there are things you can control, and I think you need to focus on what you can control and accept what you can't. Have a roadmap, have a plan, have a backup plan, and have your backup plan, have a backup plan.
Exactly. And would that be the same message you have for the current students here, the current international students? Is it
Right.
the same?
I would say to those who are already here, who are very fortunate to have done, their study permit during the pandemic of all times. Quite frankly, that's not easy. Congratulations, you're basically through one of the toughest steps, which is to get through the front door. So that's great, but don't let your investment go down the drain very easily. Let's put it this way in aggregate terms. So every year, Canada takes in approximately 400 to 450,000 new permanent residents. And in that number, only about half are under economic immigration, because the balance of it would go to families and to Canada's international commitments under humanitarian and refugee programs. So let's say half of it is about 220,000 new permanent residents allocated for permanent residents under the economic programs, and that would be divided across different programs under Express Entry, provincial nomination programs. So let's just be generous and say 200,000. 200,000 versus how many international students coming in every year. So according to the report that was released very recently, there are about 600,000 international students in Canada actively studying. So you do the math, 600,000 versus 200,000. Guys, this isn't a joke. It's very competitive. You can't do it on an ad hoc basis. At the very least, have a plan. research, do more research, consult with the right people.
Exactly. And yeah, I think, like, because we're speaking facts right now and numbers, do you have any insight on, like, how many international students actually fail to become permanent residents when that time comes and they actually have to go back home? How often does that happen? Is it normal, or do you have any insights on that?
So my main insight is it's hard to peg it down specifically because we are in a period of transition. Pre-COVID, there were statistics and you can access it through government databases. I just don't know the exact number as of now. But what's important to note is that because of the pandemic, there was a surge, a bulge of international students coming in. Again, mainly because other opportunities closed and Canada kept its open. And a lot of it is because of like demand and just, you know, a desire to just move. The push factors coming into Canada are just greater because of the pandemic, right? So because we have so many international students right now and we have levels planned that are attuned not necessarily for that, it is something to be seen how we are going to transition that. But what we gather from the recent report that was released is that the government really is in an introspective mode to basically look into how the international student program is going to be revamped, reformed, in order to make it fit better to the current needs of Canada and fit better to the existing programs for permanent residents, because the government of Canada does recognize that this is a, you know, important source of new permanent residents and new Canadians.
Yeah, so Lou, thank you so much. I think we have an offer for viewers right now in terms of, like, if you want to consult with Lou and his team. I think we currently have an offer. Lou, can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, just check the link out below. We will have you directed to a website where you can use the code which will appear on the screen. And when you use that code at checkout, you will get a discount.
Amazing. So do check out the links below. And is it going to be limited to like a certain number of people or a certain number of days?
First 100 consultations going through your channel will get that discount.
Wow, guys, first 100 consultation. And yeah, check the link below. It's going to be really worth your time, really worth the investment. Lou's amazing. He's helped us become permanent residents in another 2 years. He's just awesome. All right, Lou, thank you so much for your time. And do you have anything to promote in terms of like social media presence or like the other thing?
Oh yeah, so follow me and my associate Andrew Colton on Twitter. Our handles are below. We do every day, like, you know, snippets, sometimes comedy related stuff when it comes to immigration, but we do post like very serious and important updates over on Twitter. And go check out our website. We have a ton of blog posts over there that talk about immigration. In fact, there's one feature article I'd like to point out down below. It's essentially a blog post that talks about access to healthcare for international students in Canada.
Ooh, that's important, y'all. Check those out. Lou, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, really appreciate it. And yeah, that's it for today. If that gave you some value, again, check the links below. Hit comment, hit subscribe, hit the notification, and we'll see you next time. Peace.